Year 10 and 11, welcome to your analysis of Inspector Goole from an Inspector Calls in preparation for your AQA English Literature exam. In order to fully understand the role of the Inspector in Inspector Calls, we must understand the context of the play. During the 1930s, Priestley became very concerned about the consequences of social inequality in Britain. In 1942, Priestley and others set up a new political party, the Commonwealth Party, which argued for public ownership of land, greater democracy and a new morality in politics. This party later merged with the Labour Party, and that was in 1945. Priestley was influential in developing the idea of the welfare state, which began to be put into place at the end of the war. He believed that further world wars could only be avoided through cooperation and mutual respect between countries, and so became active in the early movement for United Nations. In a play which is about socialism, the Inspector represents socialist ideals and, more importantly, the Labour Manifesto. It is vitally important that we understand that Priestley wrote the play in 1945 but set it in 1912. If we start on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that the First World War would start in 2 years, and Birling's optimistic view that there would not be a war, in the quotation, "the Germans don't want war," is completely wrong. There were strong distinctions between the upper and lower classes. Women were subservient to men. All a well-off woman could do was get married. A poor woman was seen as cheap labour. Remember, it is Sheila who says, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And the ruling classes saw no need to change the status quo. If we move over to 1945, the Second World War ended in Europe. People were recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger and uncertainty. Class distinctions had been greatly reduced as a result of the war. Women had earned a more valued place in society because naturally they helped making the weapons during World War II. There was a great desire for social change. Immediately after the Second World War, Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide victory over Winston Churchill and the Conservatives. J.B. Priestley uses his play as a piece of propaganda in support of the Labour Party. Please remember that this play is propaganda. That is the whole purpose. It's not to entertain. It was to gain support for the Labour Party and to outline the issues with a Conservative government. I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again because it's important. The Inspector is a symbol of socialist views and the Labour Party. He embodies the Labour Manifesto in his final speech about we are responsible for one another, which I'll come to in a moment when we analyse quotations. Who is Inspector Goole and what is his role in the play? First of all, he is a dramatic catalyst. He is the dramatic catalyst in the play because he speeds up all of the events. He speeds up Mr. Birling confessing, Sheila confessing, Gerald, Mrs. Birling and finally Eric. On more than one occasion he refers to time. He keeps saying that time is moving on and he doesn't have much time, and therefore he places greater pressure on each individual to confess their wrongdoings. He also acts as an interrogator. Obviously, that goes without saying. He questions each family member. We are told that in the opening he has a disconcerting and hard way of looking at people to place them under pressure. So the way he questions them, one line of inquiry at a time, again places them under more pressure to answer because they feel singled out. He is a moral teacher. Remember, he teaches the family about responsibility, about caring for one another, about confessing to one's crimes. Sheila and Eric learn the lessons he is teaching. Mr. and Mrs. Birling feel. He is also the voice of J.B. Priestley himself. He voices all of the concerns J.B. Priestley has about society and about the government. And finally, through the name Goole, we ask ourselves if he is real, because obviously Goole, spelled Ghoul, means ghost. So by the end of the play, we question whether he was real. And then again, this is interpretation, whether or not you think he was there or not, whether or not you think he is actually the conscience of each character. A little bit more detail about the Inspector then. As I said, he is Priestley's voice. He represents Priestley's moral views about society. His ultimate job is to make the characters change their attitude, to face up to what they've done and start taking responsibility. I will come to his final speech in a moment. He heightens the drama. His entrances and exits are well timed in order to create tension. For example, the end of Act 1 when he walks in on Gerald and Sheila's conversation. This is massively important because he controls the structure of the play. Each revelation moves the play one step forward, which is why he is the catalyst. He arrives at a critical time in the play. He interrupts Mr. Birling and his selfish views. Remember, Mr. Birling has literally just said a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. Then all of a sudden we hear that the doorbell rings. The inspector's role is to show that this is not true and that people should look after each other. If we pay close attention to the stage directions, we absolutely have to, because this is a play. Remember, in the exam you must refer to it as a play rather than a book or a novel or anything else. It is a play. He is described in the stage directions as giving an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. Therefore, he takes charge immediately and remains in control throughout. He remains solid as each of the characters break down, and nothing distracts him from his main purpose. He is there to challenge and investigate. He has a habit of looking hard at the person he is interrogating before speaking, and this makes the characters nervous. You can see that straight away with Sheila in the stage directions. She is constantly described as distressed. He directs the investigation carefully, dealing with one line of inquiry at a time. Therefore, he controls the structure of the play. He also controls which character speaks and when. If you look closely at his stage directions, cutting in is a quotation that is used over and over again because he interrupts each character. Cutting in massively is another quotation. He does not let Mr. Birling or Mrs. Birling or any of the characters speak when they want. Therefore, he controls not only the play, their responses and the timing. He uses aggressive and shocking language to make the characters feel guilty for the part they have played in Eva Smith's death. For instance, she died in misery and agony. Every time he describes how she died, when he says she swallowed some disinfectant and it burned her inside out, Sheila reacts emotionally. So by using this type of shocking and aggressive language, he forces the characters to feel sympathy for Eva Smith, therefore accepting what they've done, Sheila and Eric particularly. Okay, so the most important quotations for the inspector. Remember, this is an unseen exam, so you won't have the book. You need to remember quotations. You don't need to remember them word for word. You can paraphrase, but I do think a grade 8 and a grade 9, your A and your A star will probably quote Priestley word for word. So he speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. That builds on from the last slide when I talked about him putting pressure on each individual. The adjective disconcerting shows you that he makes them feel uneasy through his questioning and through the way he questions. When he first arrives, again, stage directions are massively important. The lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives. Then it should be brighter and harder. Bright and harder here shows that when he arrives, it's metaphorical, obviously. It's the idea that he's going to shine a light on what each character has done to Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, whoever you think the girl is, whether you think it's one girl or different girls. So when the lighting changes, it changes the whole mood of the play and shows us that the inspector is there for one particular purpose, and that's to make them accept what they have done. He explains that it's a chain of events, doesn't he, when he says, because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, a chain of events. So he says that to Mr. Birling, doesn't he? And it is a chain of events because Eva Smith, the poor thing, has no luck really. She's fired by Mr. Birling. Sheila gets her fired. Gerald sleeps with her. Eric sleeps with her. Mrs. Birling won't give her the charity she needs. So it is a chain of events. And remember, Mr. Birling denies that he's done anything wrong. And the inspector is pointing out that actually he started it all. he started the whole process. Mrs. Birling also says at the end, it wasn't me who fired her from her work and started it all. So even Mrs. Birling blames Mr. Birling at one point. As I said earlier, one of his roles is to interrogate the family, quotation. It's my duty to ask questions. So that shows you that he is there to question them, and his questions are structured so that they answer in the way he wants. Remember, he controls how they answer by interrupting, by describing the death in awful detail, by not letting them speak when they want, by not letting them see the photograph. So he controls everything that they do. Again, this is why he's the catalyst. When talking to Mr. Birling and defending Eva Smith, he says it's better to ask for the earth than to take it, because Mr. Birling's saying, oh, if I'd gave her a pay rise, she would have wanted more, and then there would have been, they would have wanted the earth. Mr. Birling, the inspector defends Eva here, doesn't he, by saying, it's better that she came to you and asked for a few more shillings. Unfortunately, Mr. Birling, remember, because he's a capitalist representation of capitalist society, won't give her the pay rise that she longs for, and at the end feels very guilty for it. When I said, obviously, he describes the death in detail, here's another quotation to prove that. This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died after several hours of agony tonight in the infirmary. So emotive language in agony is what distresses Sheila, and I suppose later on to some extent, when Eric realises that he's the one that actually had got her pregnant. So remember, shocking and aggressive language is one of the techniques he uses to unsettle them, because Mr. Birling tells him to stop talking like that. It's obviously frowned upon by the upper classes to be speaking in such a shocking and aggressive way. I did tell you earlier that he controls time. When I'm talking about remembering quotations and remembering short quotes, this one's a simple one. I haven't much time. Very simple to remember. As I said earlier, he's the catalyst. He controls time and the pace of the play. The play is very fast. Everything happens very quickly, doesn't it? So I haven't much time shows us just how important he is in terms of controlling everything. Stage directions there, cutting in massively. I mentioned it earlier. Cutting in and cutting in massively are repeated by J.B. Priestley all the way through, once again to show us the power of the inspector. Mr. Birling keeps mentioning his social reputation. I know such and such, I know such and such, I know all of the police. And Inspector Goole isn't fazed, and he interrupts him all of the time. He interrupts all of the characters so they can't speak when they want, they can't say what they want. Again, another method of control. So the adverb massively there shows us that he's not letting people finish. One line of inquiry at a time, otherwise we'll all be talking at once and we won't know where we are. Massive quotation to show that he puts pressure on each individual character and they feel a little bit victimised, and that is when they start confessing to what they've done. So he singles out Mr. Birling, then he singles out Sheila. Gerald leaves and then comes back. Eric leaves, so he does place pressure on each character. He expresses his opinion as well. Now remember, he is the voice of J.B. Priestley, as well as Labour ideals. I think you did something terribly wrong and you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. This quotation comes down to interpretation. Sheila regrets it. Eric regrets it. I think to some extent Gerald regrets it. This quote I don't think applies to Mr. and Mrs. Birling because they don't take responsibility for what they've done and they think they're justified. So that quotation there I think is only for the younger generations. Remember, it's Mr. Birling that points out that there's a difference between the younger generations and himself. But that there is obviously J.B. Priestley's thoughts about society and how we should look after each other. I did say I was going to do the final speech in a little bit more detail, so I'll do that on the next slide where I can put the whole speech. The inspector's last speech. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other, and I tell you that the time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. If we are doing a close analysis here, you've got the inclusive pronoun we, which immediately sets up the idea of community and society and looking after one another and the idea that we're all in it together. His last speech, as I said before, is political really, isn't it? Whilst the play of face value is, characters who have affected a woman's life. Actually, when we look past that, J.B. Priestley's play is political. And this speech represents the Labour manifesto. It represents socialist ideas. It's this idea that we need to look after one another. It's what the inspector has been trying to teach the Birlings all the way through the play. Now, interestingly, he says, if we don't learn to look after each other, we will be taught this lesson in fire, blood and anguish. Now, that is a reference to the war. So he's saying if we don't learn to look after one another as a community and help one another, then we will almost be punished. And remember, this was written in 1945. We have had 2 world wars, haven't we, by then? So that's what he's referring to. An audience, a 1946 audience will know this. And when we're talking about a propagandist play in favour of the Labour Party and a Conservative Party have been in charge, then J.B. Priestley's quite successful in his message of we are responsible for one another. And that's what, that's what the whole play is about, responsibility. Priestley cleverly contrasts the inspector and Arthur Birling. Now, as I said earlier, the inspector is a symbol of socialism, the Labour Party. Arthur Birling is a representation of capitalist views and the Conservative Party. I've just highlighted some obviously differences there. The inspector voices J.B. Priestley's beliefs and the beliefs of the Labour Party. Arthur Birling represents the Conservative Party, and we know through his opening speech about the war and the Titanic that J.B. Priestley makes him look foolish. The inspector wants the family members to take responsibility for their actions. As I said, as he says in the last speech, his big last speech that we've just analysed, we are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. Whereas Arthur Birling denies responsibility for Eva Smith's death. He says, quote, I can't accept responsibility. So again, huge contrasting differences between the 2 characters. The inspector is classless and social position is not a concern of his. He treats everyone the same. Whereas Mr. Birling is concerned about social class and wealth. We know that. He keeps talking about if Crofts Limited and if Crofts Limited and Birling Co. join forces, there'll be a bigger force. He's constantly going on about his position. I'm just up for a knighthood. I know the police. I was Lord Mayor. Social position and wealth is very important to him, isn't it? I mean, he wouldn't even give Eva Smith the extra shilling she asked for. The inspector encourages the characters to change, and he is successful with Sheila and Eric. Mr. Birling is unwilling to change. I remind you of the opening page of the play. The stage directions say that Mr. Birling is provincial in his speech. The adjective provincial means that he is narrow-minded and unwilling to change. So on the first page of the play, Priestley sets up Mr. Birling, and he doesn't change, does he, at all? We might argue that he's one-dimensional in that way because at the end he's the same as he was at the beginning, whereas Sheila changes and Eric changes, and I think to some extent Gerald changes as well. Mrs. Birling does not change. So just some differences there between the inspector and Arthur Birling. An example introduction for a question about the inspector could look like this. The play An Inspector Calls is set in 1912, but was written in 1945. It was written by J.B. Priestley and is considered a classic play in English literature. The narrative focuses on a middle-class family, the Birlings, and the visit they receive from Inspector Goole. The inspector is investigating the suicide of an Eva Smith. As the play progresses, Inspector Goole reveals that all of the family members are responsible for her death in one way or another. The theme of the play challenges the old ideas of 1912, where everyone was supposed to provide for themselves, and the new idea is that the state would provide help during times of need and desperation. In 1945, a Labour government had come into power and they introduced the welfare state, where in times of need such as unemployment, benefits would be available and people would not be at the mercy of charity decided upon by people like the Birlings. Priestley was a Labour supporter and so believed in the welfare state, and this play reflects his beliefs. The inspector seems to voice the views of Priestley, particularly in his final speech, "We are responsible for each other." The inspector often acts as a conscience throughout the play, showing that the welfare state and the idea of looking after the whole community is for the best. Initially, the role of the inspector seems to be that of making the Birlings understand and recognise how seemingly unimportant events can have disastrous consequences. However, on closer inspection, he operates in a more complex manner and is more than just a character. He is the catalyst for the play's events. Mysteriously, he knows an incredible amount about each character, and he knows the history of Eva Smith and the Birlings' role in her death. The audience is left questioning who the inspector really is. Is he a ghost? Goole reminds us of Goole. Is he the voice of Priestley? Is he the voice of God? Some examples on this slide then about how the inspector creates tension. So there's a quotation at the top there showing annoyance, any particular reason why I shouldn't see this girl's photograph, inspector. So remember, he controls who sees the photograph and why, and this really annoys the family, doesn't it? So that quotation shows that. Look at the stage directions showing annoyance. The inspector answers, look coolly looking hard at him. Look at the adverb coolly. The inspector is central to the play as he draws out the part each family member has played and controls the flow of the conversation by butting in and controlling time. Mr. Birling answers the questions but then tries to dismiss the inspector by repeating that he cannot help with the investigation. I've told you all I know and it doesn't seem to me very important. So Mr. Birling's denial of responsibility reflects the ideas of the society the play is set in 1912. And once again, Birling's speech about the war on the Titanic, how would he look to an audience in 1945? He would look very foolish, wouldn't he? The inspector exerts a lot of power over the family, doesn't he? I've put a lot of quotations on there for you, which are stage directions. I did tell you stage directions were important, particularly adverbs. Sharply, dryly, impressively, massively, calmly, deliberately. So adverbs are massive here in terms of showing the power he has and how he reacts to others, cutting in calmly, you know, that annoys the Birling family, cutting in massively when he interrupts Mr. Birling, calmly. The inspector doesn't really get riled by the family, rather they get annoyed by him. Stage directions show the power he has over them and how he controls them, really. I mean, look at that top one, inspector. Slowly, are you sure you don't know? He looks at Gerald, then at Eric, then at Sheila. Yeah, and that type of hard look, which we've already looked at, makes them feel pressure, doesn't it? Makes them think, oh my God, maybe I do know, and question their own thoughts and their own ideas. So finally, the inspector, remember, has many roles: dramatic catalyst, teacher, the voice of J.B. Priestley, a symbol of the Labour Party, a symbol of socialist ideals or socialist ideas. You should be asking yourself, obviously, how does he reflect Priestley's own views? What has been happening in Priestley's society that has influenced him? So the world wars and the conservative government. What message does he want to send to the audience? Well, naturally, that's a message about responsibility, the power of socialism, perhaps how the world needs to change in terms of looking after one another. Remember, Priestley got involved with the United Nations because he wanted countries to cooperate with one another rather than fight. So, the inspector is more than just a character because he is a symbol of bigger ideas. I hope this video has been useful. If you want any more of my videos, just type in my name, Stacey Reay, Stacey, and Reay is Reay, into YouTube, and my AQA poetry videos are there, Frankenstein, and an Inspector Goole. Good luck in your English literature exam.